The 3rd of October, 1986. 800 miles east of Bermuda. A void of dark water, 400 feet below the waves. Deep within the steel hull of the USS Augusta, Senior Chief Petty Officer Michael Harkins felt the familiar pressure of his headphones. A gateway to a world of unseen predators. For 14 years, his ears had been the front line of the Cold War. He knew the sounds of Soviet submarines not as a technician, but as a virtuoso knows an orchestra. The rhythmic pulse of a pump, the unique groan of a specific valve. Every vessel possessed its own acoustic fingerprint. And then, a signature that didn't belong. Bearing 320 degrees, at a range of 12,000 yards, was the Yankee-class ballistic missile boat his team had designated Sierra 2. But the sound it was making was alien, a precise, deliberate hiss. It was the sound of flooding, but not the chaotic rush of a breach, nor the controlled intake of water into ballast tanks. This was different, focused. It emanated from midships, from the missile compartment. Commander Robert Fitzgerald, the Augusta's captain, stood in the silence of the sonar shack. For 6 days, his submarine had shadowed Sierra 2, a ghost in its wake. The mission was routine, a silent dance of deterrence played out in chewing of the conflict, a game of cat and mouse where the world's fate hung in the balance. But this sound, this was not part of the game. Harkins manipulated the filters, his fingers flying across the console. The waterfall display painted a clear picture in cascading green light. High-pressure water, flowing into a confined space. One of Sierra 2's missile tubes was being intentionally flooded. 3 minutes later, the strange, controlled hiss fractured. It became erratic, panicked. The acoustic signature warped, telling a story of pressure differentials spiraling out of control. The deliberate action had become a desperate crisis. Then came the sound that made the blood run cold. A low, tortured groan that traveled through the water not as a noise, but as a physical warning. It was the sound of metal surrendering to immense, unbearable stress. Something deep inside Sierra 2's pressure hull was failing. Harkins looked up, his eyes meeting the captain's. Fitzgerald's face was a mask of pale comprehension. They were no longer observers in a silent game. They were witnesses to a catastrophe in the making. What no one in that sonar shack could know, what even the doomed crew of the Soviet submarine did not fully understand, was that this single, terrifying moment was the final echo of a failure set in motion 18 months before. The submarine, officially known as K-219, had developed a minute leak in missile tube number 6 on its previous patrol. Back in the shipyards of Gadjevo, engineers had patched the flaw. They had sealed the tube, certified it operational, and sent their vessel back into the abyss. But the repair had not held. And now, hundreds of feet beneath the Atlantic, that 18-month-old secret was tearing a nuclear submarine apart from the inside out. For 3 days, the Atlantic Ocean had been finding its way inside. A relentless, seeping intrusion into missile tube number 6 of the Soviet submarine K-219. Down in the cold, pressurized dark, the salt water was mixing with residual rocket fuel, beginning a silent, venomous chemistry. A reaction that was building pressure moment by moment, pushing the steel walls of the silo far beyond their engineered limits. Inside this chamber sat an RSM-25 ballistic missile. And atop that missile, a single, city-ending nuclear warhead. It was no longer a weapon in its silo. It had become a bomb within a bomb. A steel coffin slowly being primed to explode from the inside out. And the crew, sealed within their own steel world, had no idea.
Senior Lieutenant Nikolai Shumkov was a man who understood the machine he lived in. He was making his rounds through the missile compartment, a cavern of vertical tombs, when a detail snagged his attention. The temperature gauge on tube 6. It read 38 degrees Celsius. It should have been a placid 18. A small discrepancy, but in the unforgiving physics of a nuclear submarine, there are no small discrepancies. In turn, consulted the maintenance logs. The paper trail was clean. The tube had been certified. No problems reported. The conclusion was simple, comfortable. A faulty sensor. But Shumkov felt the submarine's truth in his bones. He had served on K-219 for 2 years. He knew its groans, its rhythms, the unique symphony of its lifeblood pumping through 1,000 pipes. He knew its voice. And something was dissonant. Something was deeply wrong. He requested permission to conduct a manual inspection, to lay his own eyes and hands on the problem. Permission was denied. They were deep in hostile waters, a ghost in the enemy's backyard. The captain's orders were absolute. Silence. Unnecessary movement, the opening of a hatch. Any deviation from the silent routine could create a noise, a transient acoustic signature that would betray their existence to the hunters, who were always, always listening. Aboard one such hunter, the American submarine USS Augusta, a sonar technician named Harkins was listening, and he was hearing something new. Through the wash of the ocean's background noise, a faint but distinct hiss emerged from the bearing of the Soviet sub. The sound of gas escaping under immense pressure. Then, the acoustic profile changed violently. The subtle hiss was consumed by a roar. A flooding noise, not gradual but instantaneous. The sound of a floodgate being torn from its hinges. An analyst named Fitzgerald grabbed the line to the control room. This was no longer passive surveillance. This was the sound of a leviathan dying. Back inside K-219, the pressure relief valve on tube 6 surrendered. It did not fail. It was annihilated. A scalding geyser of seawater and vaporized rocket fuel erupted through the valve housing, filling the compartment with a toxic, corrosive fog. Shumkov, who had defied orders and remained near the tube, watched the valve disintegrate in a spray of chemical foam. He lunged for the alarm panel. A brutal metallic scream tore through every compartment of the submarine. Fire in the missile compartment. All hands to emergency stations. Captain Igor Britanov was in his cabin when the alarm shattered the quiet. He reached the control room in less than 20 seconds, moving into a storm of contradictory chaos. Fire, flooding, a pressure spike in tube 6, a hull breach. Every report that crackled over the intercom was worse than the last. There was no time for deliberation, only for action. He made the decision that would define the fate of his boat and his crew. Emergency surface. Blow all ballast tanks. Get this submarine to the surface, to the air, where they could fight the fire with the hatches open, where the crew would have a chance. The ballast control officer's hands flew across his panel. High-pressure air roared into the ballast tanks, a thunderous counterattack against the crushing weight of the sea. The silent, 3-day seep of the Atlantic had culminated in a desperate, violent race back to the sky. A sound tears through the cold, silent depths. Not of nature, but of machine. A violent, percussive roar that rips through the hydrophones of the USS Augusta. To the trained ear of sonar operator Ken Harkins, it is an unmistakable signature. The sound of a submarine in profound distress. It is the scream of compressed air, blasting water from ballast tanks in a desperate, uncontrolled ascent. Sierra 2, the Soviet submarine they have been tracking for hours,
is going up. Fast. This is not a controlled maneuver. This is an emergency blow. A creature of the deep, wounded and fighting for the surface. On the bridge of the Augusta, the atmosphere shifts from patient surveillance to high alert. The tactical action officer is on the line, his voice a low, urgent hum. A surfacing Soviet submarine changes every calculation. The rules of engagement, the silent pact of the Cold War abyss, are suddenly in flux. If the vessel is damaged, if it is sinking, a new protocol takes precedence over espionage. The law of the sea, the duty to render aid. There are men on that boat. But there is something else too. Something that chills the blood far more than the Atlantic depths. The K-219 is a Yankee-class ballistic missile submarine, and inside its hull, it carries 16 nuclear-tipped missiles. If that submarine is flooding, if it is going down, those weapons are going down with it. The United States Navy needs to know precisely what is happening. The K-219 breaches the surface at an impossible angle, a steel leviathan clawing its way into the air. Tons of seawater cascade from its dark, scarred hull. Captain Igor Bratunov orders the bridge hatch opened. A gasp of clean, salt-laced air pours into the suffocating confines of the control room. A fleeting reprieve. Below, in the missile compartment, hell has broken loose. The initial explosion in Missile Tube 6 has ruptured more than just the missile casing. It has severed a coolant line, unleashing a cloud of toxic propellant. The smoke is thick, acrid, and deadly. 3 sailors have already succumbed, their bodies limp in the narrow passageways. A damage control team, led by Petty Officer Shumkov, fights to seal the compartment, to contain the fire. But the source of the poison cannot be contained. The missile tube itself is venting a furious chemical reaction, building pressure, building heat. The warhead inside is beginning to cook. If it explodes, the warhead will rupture, contaminating the entire vessel with radioactive material. A far worse scenario looms. The volatile solid rocket fuel could detonate with enough force to trigger a sympathetic explosion in the adjacent silos. A chain reaction. 16 nuclear warheads, each many times more powerful than the bomb that leveled Hiroshima, turning a single submarine into a floating, fissile bomb in the middle of the Atlantic. Bratunov understands the precipice on which he and his crew are balanced. He is out of options. He gives the order. An order that defies every submariner's instinct. Flood Missile Tube 6. Deliberately. Use the enemy, the ocean itself, to save them. Open the boat to the sea to quench the fire within. 30 minutes earlier, aboard the Augusta, this was the sound of an unknown malfunction. A mystery. Now, as the acoustic signature repeats, the American crew understands. They are not listening to an accident. They are listening to an act of containment. They are hearing a captain's desperate, impossible choice. The Soviet commander is fighting to prevent a nuclear nightmare. Harkins and Fitzgerald listen. They listen as the sea rushes in, a controlled deluge against an uncontrolled fire. They listen as the pressure inside the tube surrenders to the crushing pressure outside. They listen as the furious chemical reaction is slowly, violently drowned. For 8 agonizing minutes, the K-219 hangs on the surface, a wounded animal, as the Atlantic pours into its missile section. And then, silence. The frantic sound of flooding ceases. The submarine's internal chaos seems to quiet, replaced by the familiar steady thrum of machinery and pumps. But the crisis is not over. It has merely changed its form. The explosion that started the fire has also fractured the submarine's very bones. The immense pressure hull is compromised. The act of saving the world from a nuclear fire has inflicted a fatal wound. Water is now entering the submarine faster than the pumps can expel it. The sound that began as a violent eruption has faded, replaced by the quiet, inexorable whisper of the Atlantic seeping through a mortal injury. The K-219 is no longer fighting a fire. It is now fighting the ocean itself. The ocean's silence is a fragile thing. Deep beneath the waves, it is a silence of immense pressure, of unseen life, of hunters and the hunted moving as ghosts in the dark. On October 3, 1986, that silence was broken, violently. A catastrophic explosion tore through the missile compartment of the Soviet submarine K-219. Seawater, cold and relentless, began its assault. Captain Bradanov, facing the abyss, made a series of brutal, calculated decisions. All non-essential personnel were ordered forward, away from the breach. He commanded the watertight doors between compartments sealed, a move that turned sections of his own vessel into premature tombs. The stern of the submarine was abandoned to the ocean, a deliberate sacrifice to save the whole. K-219 was dying, one steel-walled chamber at a time. A desperate message crackled into the ether. A plea, transmitted on high-frequency radio, unencrypted, stripped bare of all Cold War secrecy for the entire world to hear. Submarine K-219, missile tube explosion. Reactor emergency shutdown complete, attempting to maintain positive buoyancy. Require immediate assistance. That raw cry for help was intercepted. Every NATO listening post in the Atlantic heard it. And 4,000 yards away, concealed in the deep, the American attack submarine USS Augusta heard it clearest of all. For Commander Fitzgerald, the message presented an impossible paradox. Before him was a Soviet submarine in its death throes, its crew fighting for their lives. But it was also a strategic nuclear asset, a prize the United States had been tracking for invaluable intelligence. To reveal the Augusta's position by offering assistance would be to compromise weeks of painstaking surveillance. It would expose the incredible reach of American tracking capabilities, telling the Soviets exactly how close their adversaries could get, undetected. It would be a strategic gift of unimaginable value. There was another calculation in this cold arithmetic of war. Soviet rescue ships were already storming the waves just 6 hours away. K-219 was still afloat, its crew still fighting, still transmitting. They had not yet abandoned ship. The Augusta could remain a ghost. It could continue its silent vigil, recording every sound, documenting Soviet emergency procedures, gathering intelligence that might one day save American lives. The decision was made. The USS Augusta remained silent. It remained hidden. It remained 4,000 yards away, a passive witness to a slow-motion catastrophe. At his sonar station, Petty Officer Harkin listened, and a cold sickness bloomed in his gut. His headphones were not filled with the sterile pings of sonar, but with the sounds of a dying leviathan. He could hear the furious gush of water spreading through the hull. He could hear the desperate, failing scream of the emergency bilge pumps. He could hear the groans of stressed metal as the submarine settled deeper, compartment by compartment, surrendering to the crushing weight of the sea. For 3 agonizing hours he listened. And then he heard a sound that would echo in his memory for the rest of his life. The distinct metallic clatter of men evacuating. The rush of air from the forward escape trunk. Soviet sailors abandoning their ship, their home, their tomb. Captain Bradanov had held on as long as humanly possible. The submarine was lost. 4 men would not make it. 3 died from smoke inhalation in the first chaotic moments. A 4th, Seaman Sergei Priminin, entered the reactor compartment to manually shut down the nuclear reactors, a final act to prevent an oceanic Chernobyl. He succeeded, averting a world-altering disaster. But by the time he finished his task, the flooding had sealed his escape. He died alone in the heart of the machine he had tamed. The surviving crew were picked up by Soviet merchant vessels. 3 days later, its long battle over, K-219 gave up its last breath of air and began its final, silent descent. Down, through 18,000 feet of black water. It came to rest on the abyssal plain, a steel monument to a secret war, its secrets kept forever by the crushing, absolute silence of the deep. A silence its crew had once commanded, and to which their vessel had now returned. It plunged to the ocean floor, a silent sarcophagus carrying 16 nuclear warheads. There it remains, a ghost on the bed of the Atlantic, a permanent, radioactive monument to a war fought in the shadows. And from the darkness, the USS Augusta watched it all, a silent witness. Every groan of tortured metal, every desperate command, every protocol for a catastrophe in motion was captured, recorded, analyzed. The secrets gleaned from that single October day would redefine American submarine doctrine for 2 decades. The sounds of a dying vessel became a textbook for survival. But for Senior Chief Harkins and Commander Fitzgerald, the strategic victory was hollow. A question echoed in the silence between sonar pings, a question that would never leave them. Could they have intervened? Should they have broken their silence? Could 4 men, 4 lives, have been spared? The official commendation was clear. They had made the correct choice. The mission was intelligence. The Cold War demanded such a price. But logic offers little comfort against memory. On quiet nights, alone in the sonar shack, the sound would return. The rush of water. The final moments of a Soviet submarine dying on the other side of the hull, while he could do nothing but listen.